Good evening. I'm Carol Fitzgerald from Bookreporter.com, a website from the Book Report Network. I'm excited to welcome you this evening with Tom Donadio, our editorial director, for our end of year reviewer event, where 11 of our Book Reporter reviewers are joining us to share limited to three, of their favorite books that were published for the first time in 2022. Now, please note that this group of reviewers has reviewed more than 1,000 books for us over the last year. So know that this selection process was not easy for them at all. Each of them has told us that narrowing it down to three has been a huge challenge. Now, our reviewers hail from all over North America, which is something we pride ourselves on. In the chat down below, if you could let us know where you're from and share your favorite book published in 2022. So we're going to challenge you as well to put that down there. For tonight's Q&A event, please note that we're not going to be doing Q&A. Simply, we've got such a jam-packed program. So we're going to only have you speaking in chat down there. If you tell us where you're from, what your favorite book was, that will be terrific. So Tom, do you want to say hi to everyone as well?
Yeah, hi everybody. So great to have you all here. We're really looking forward. This is going to be a really fun evening. We look forward to this every year.
So Tom, let's begin with Norah Piehl, and you can introduce her for us, please.
Yep, absolutely. So Norah Piehl worked for 10 years at the Boston Book Festival, overseeing their day-to-day operations. She's now the director for literary programs at the Bay Area Book Festival. Norah is a former children's bookseller and has also worked in the publishing industry for both university and trade publishers.
So Nora's going to kick us off with What We Fed to the Manticore by Talia Lakshmi. Am I have that right? Kalori. Am I right on that?
Yep, I think that's right.
I had Tom giving me all the ones that were hard to pronounce.
Yeah.
Just happened to work out that way.
Yeah, so What We Fed to the Manticore is a debut collection of 9 short stories. And each of the stories, this is kind of unique, is from the perspective of an animal. So that might sound kind of cutesy or precious, but take my word for this, they are anything but. Many of the stories address human and animal or human and natural conflict. So for example, there's a story called A Level of Tolerance, which is about 832F, the Yellowstone wolf, you might recall several years back was shot by a hunter, the most photographed wolf in all of Yellowstone. And so it's a story told from the wolf's perspective, which is really fascinating. And as you can imagine, rather heart-wrenching as well. There's also an equally heartbreaking story called May God Forever Bless the Rhino Keepers, which is this told from the perspective of a dog that is tasked with guarding one of the last remaining white rhinos in the face of poachers. So other stories focus on animals as innocent victims of human activity, including climate change. So there's The Good Donkey, which is about a zoo that's opened in the Israeli-occupied territories. And then there's the title story, What We Fed to the Manticore, told from the point of view of a so-called man-eating tiger. And they can't understand why their habitat and food supplies are disappearing, even though readers, of course, will understand that this is all the effects of climate change. So these stories are really empathetic, but they're also grounded in science. And in fact, she includes at the end a list of her source material, which is really fascinating. So you can see if you want to read more about the underpinnings of these stories, it's all there, which is really great for those of us who really want to sort of dig into some of these topics and realize the stakes that are at play here.
And told them from a story point of view. It's just lovely to see how they do this. Someone's asking if you could hold the book cover up again. If you could just hold it up one more time. Yeah, I think it looks so terrific. And someone is asking in chat if we're going to be sending out lists of all the titles. I sent them out about an hour ago. So if anybody didn't get them, I will send them when we send the video afterwards, but just know the titles were sent before. So because a couple of people keep asking that. So there's your first title.
Now, your next title has been on many best of lists. So tell us your thoughts about Gabrielle Zeffen's Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow.
Yeah, so I have been a fan of Gabrielle Zevin for a really long time. In fact, Tom, I was looking back today and I realized that I interviewed Gabrielle for Teen Reads back in 2007 for y'all.
Wow, that's
So,
right. Yeah.
yes. So it's been
You and
really
her go
lovely
way
to
back.
see her. Sorry, go ahead.
You and her go way back.
Yes, exactly. And it's been really wonderful to see her sort of grow and her reputation just grow and grow. And to be honest, this new one, which I also have behind me, I can hold it up. This new one, Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, might be my very favorite book that she's written. She's written for a young adult audience, and this is an adult novel. And it reminded me a lot of Michael Chabon's Cavalier and Clay, in that it sort of traces this, it's sort of an epic story of a creative friendship. So in this case, the friends are Sam and Sadie, who first meet when they're preteens in a children's hospital waiting room, where Sam is there continually while he's undergoing some reconstructive surgery following an accident. And he's also undergone some emotional trauma. And Sadie is there because her sister is going through chemotherapy treatments. And so they just spend a lot of time. I mean, we've all spent time in hospital waiting rooms. They bond over video games, and that's what brings them together and sort of brings Sam out of this really dark place. However, they have this falling out, and they only reunite several years later when they're both in college in Boston. Sadie is studying computer programming at MIT, and Sam is sort of reluctantly studying math at Harvard. They're both super brilliant, and they decide to do what, you know, countless others at the same time were doing, which is to drop out of their respective programs and focus all their attention on starting a video game company, which is actually way more successful than I think either of them expected from the beginning. So like I said, this novel extends over 30 years of their friendship and really traces the evolution of this really complicated relationship that they have, which is also both enriched and made more, complicated and difficult by the fact that they work together and create things together. So you might not, if you're not a video gamer, Gabrielle Zevin is a gamer, and so she includes lots of very sort of inside information about video games. And those of us who grew up sort of contemporaneously with the characters will recognize a lot of these games like Oregon Trail and the early Zelda games. But even if you're not a gamer, this novel is about so much more than that. It's about creativity, and it's about jealousy, and about the different ways, the different forms of love that can be so rewarding and meaningful over the course of a lifetime. And it's also really about storytelling, both within the video game universe, and then, of course, on sort of a meta level in this really amazing way that Zevin unfolds the story.
Mm.
Yeah, no wonder.
That's not been on my list. Now I want that on my list.
It's so good.
Yeah. No wonder it's on so many best of lists. It just seems to have so much appeal to so many different audiences, especially with her built-in YA following.
Yeah, exactly.
That's great. And so now your last title is Run Towards the Danger by Sarah Polley. So what can you tell us about this one?
Yeah, so this is a memoir, and I guess it would be broadly a celebrity memoir. And I have to say, this is not a genre that I am ordinarily drawn to. But I'm such a fan of Sarah Polley's work. So she was a child actor. She's Canadian. She was a child actor on a number of television programs and movies. And she's now an award-winning screenwriter and director. In fact, her new movie, Women Talking, based on the Miriam Toews novel, is getting a lot of Oscar buzz and is in theaters later this month. She's also an activist, a political activist in Canada. So I'm a huge fan of her body of work. And when I saw that she had written this memoir in essays, I decided to pick it up, and I'm so glad that I did, because it really is, it's not like a typical celebrity tell-all kind of memoir. It really is a collection of personal essays with an overarching theme, which is our relationship to memories and how our understanding of our personal histories is always shifting based on new experiences. And conversely, how those memories and how our understanding of them shapes the decisions that we make in our lives now. So, for example, she writes about how her experiences as a child actor, she was often manipulated, and sometimes the situations were borderline abusive, really shaped the way that she has chosen and continues to choose how to parent her own children. She also writes about how her complicated medical history, as well as her mother's early death with cancer, is something that she continually has to grapple with every time she has a new health challenge. And she also really wrestles with decisions that she's made in the past, particularly with regard to a scandal that was part of the Me Too reckoning, and about how various narratives, both from her own experience and from what other people told her, affected her decision not to go public with those allegations, which is something that she's still sort of racked with even as she's writing this essay now. The title of the book comes from a kind of a surprising piece of advice that she received from a doctor after she she experienced a really severe concussion that had symptoms that just would not go away. It was threatening to become chronic. And so she went to this doctor who had a really unconventional approach. And again, sort of moving into the pain and the, not retreating from those sensations. It proved to be the only way that she could sort of get past that experience and to sort of rejoin the world. So again, this isn't a Hollywood memoir or anything close to it, but it is a really beautifully thoughtful collection of very personal essays. It's emotionally vulnerable and yet very self-assured, which is something that, I would have expected given the film work that she's done.
It's nice when they live up to what you thought they would write, like what their life lives up to exactly what they thought they would do.
Yes, definitely.
Thank you so much for joining us, Norah. It's always great to hear you talk about books.
Thank you so much,
thanks
Norah.
for inviting me.
So next up is Eileen Nicol, who has a long career writing code for computers in the tech industry. She's now retired and still enjoys writing, although for human audiences, book reviews, magazine articles, poetry, and long fiction. When she's not babysitting her grandson or reading, I love this, she sails in Alaska. I must come and join you on one of those trips. Does yoga, plays tennis, volunteers in the community, and studies Buddhism. And she lives in Washington State. So, Tom, take it away.
Yeah, great to have you here, Eileen.
Hi, thanks. Thanks for asking me.
Great to see you again. So now your first pick is The Final Case by David Guterson.
Yes. Here's the book. I've read everything that David Guterson has written, and starting with his first novel, Snow Falling on Cedars, which I think was published in the 90s and probably everyone has heard of. He had the great good fortune of being a high school teacher, and he was teaching To Kill a Mockingbird in his English classes as a high school teacher. And I think that informed the Snow Falling on Cedars, which was a huge success. This is also his latest and maybe his last novel is also a courtroom drama. I've heard it called a legal thriller, and it does have elements of that, but it's also really about families. His family, the narrator's father is 83 and is a lawyer, and he takes the final case, which involves child abuse. A girl is killed as a result of being in this family that mistreats her, and so there's a big conflict. There's a big contrast between this family and then the narrator's family. He loves and reveres his father. So it's very interesting. It's hard to categorize for me. Guterson is a really amazing writer. Everything he writes is just lush and beautiful and understated too. I mean, he's not telling you what to feel all the time. He's just showing you. So I would recommend this to anybody who's a fan of his work, or even if you're not a fan of his work.
And you say this might be his last novel. Is it his age or what's?
Well, he's in his 60s, and I'm just extrapolating kind of from the narrator starts out and says, "I have stopped writing fiction. I thought I was finished writing fiction." And you can't. This is one of those where the narrator is never named. It's in the first person. And he said, I didn't miss it. I didn't feel like it was weird not to be writing. So you can't help but kind of infer that maybe he's talking about himself. I don't know. I have no inside knowledge. I really don't know.
Yeah,
but
yeah, you just kind of wonder. You kind of wonder when you see that, right?
Yes. But his relationship with his father is very compelling, and it's a great read.
So next up, you've got George Saunders' short story collection, Liberation Day. So tell us about that, because I like when stories happen, because you just sit and read it and put it down and finished. I like that.
Yes. Yeah. Short story is, I think a more challenging genre in a way. You just don't have as much time to develop the characters. And of these 9 stories, only 3 of them are set in alternate worlds, which are kind of askew from our normal world. That's one of his specialties, is he just takes something and twists it. But even the 6 that are set in our sort of recognizable world, he just has such a very a unique perspective on the world, and he's funny and he's dark. I just really love everything he's written. I again highly recommend this one. I'm not surprised somebody else decided to present it as well.
Did the stories tie together at all, or is that everything?
No, they're independent. They're independent from each other. Yes, yeah.
And your final pick is Small World by Jonathan Evison.
Yes, this is a long book, but it goes very quickly. He's also somewhat of a local writer, and really quite a character. I reviewed his first novel, Lulu, for you guys a long time ago, and I think I picked it up in the bookstore, read the first page, bought it, and then wrote you and said, I really want to review this, because he uses a great voice in most of his novels. Not so much this. This is like he presents a lot of different families, and the premise is that it starts on a Coast Starlight trip. And the people that are on that trip, he goes back to their ancestors in the United States. So it spans, several hundred years, but he handles it really well, because each story is very well identified, like who is the character and what time are we in, and then it kind of goes back and forth, which could be really confusing, but he does a really great job with it. And I would say he's got a really it's called Small World, but it's really a big novel in a way. I thought it was very entertaining. I really liked it.
When you're talking big novel, about how many pages are we talking about?
400 something. Yeah.
My husband's reading the John Irving book, The Last Chairlift. He's reading it for, I think it's 900 pages. He carries this book every place. It's like he's sitting down reading the Bible or something. And he sits down. I said, how far are you through? And he goes, about half. And I'm like, whoa, that's an investment of time.
It really is. But this is fun. And it went by fast, and it kind of didn't want it to end. I guess.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a good feeling.
It's kind of a really good novel.
Yes. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Eileen. Thanks for joining us.
Eileen.
Thanks.
All right, now next up is Bronwyn Miller. Bronwyn Miller is the pen name for an avid reader who's been working in the publishing, film, TV space for over 25 years. In addition to loving great books and writers, she's an avid fan of theater, comedy, and podcasts. She lives in Pennsylvania. Hello, Bronwyn.
Hi, Bronwyn. Good to see you.
Hi there. Good to see you all.
So let's start with Her Last Affair by John Searles. And I'm going to tell you something that's kind of interesting, which I don't know if you know. I interviewed John when the book came out, and he said that the abandoned drive-in movie theater screen on the way to his mother's house is what inspired the novel. So that just shows that authors can get perspective from any place. And he said he just kept driving by that and said, I'm going to write something about that. So take it away from there.
That's exactly what struck me too. I heard him on a podcast being interviewed, and he mentioned that. He kept driving by and thinking, I got to put that in a story somewhere. And I remember knowing the author, John Searle, back when I worked in subrights in publishing. He was the fiction editor at Cosmopolitan magazine. So I knew him from that. And I remember when his first novel came out, I was so impressed that he worked a full-time job. And in addition to writing a novel, he would get up at like 5 a.m. and work for a couple of hours before going to his 9-to-5 job, which is never, we know, 9 to 5 strictly. But I just really have always liked his writing. This one, especially Her Last Affair, I thought really blended its 3 stories that are kind of intertwined, and you find out how the 3 characters are connected, starting with Skyla, who's an older woman who's beginning to lose her sight. And she is of the aforementioned drive-in movie theater she used to run with her husband, and now it's in disrepair and run down. And she's really easy prey for this kind of con man who comes on the scene. And you're thinking that he's definitely a con man, he's there to help her, maybe not. And it's very interesting. The 2 other characters, one is a middle-aged woman in an unhappy marriage who reconnects with her first love. And when they both, I don't know if they mentioned that it's Disney, but they both worked at a theme park in Orlando. And you kind of get the behind the scenes of what it was like to work at a theme park like that. And she reconnects with this old love from 30 years ago. And it's kind of, will they or won't they? Are they going to get together? Will she leave her marriage? You're not sure. And then the 3rd character is a writer who wanted to be a great food writer, restaurateur writer, and has just failed and is bitter. And you kind of see him revisit a person from his past. And you're reading, and he keeps you on the edge of your seat with the story. And you're just reading page after page after page because you're dying to see how these 3 people are connected, if they are at all. And he just keeps you going right until the final page. And he's just he's one of those great writers that tells a lot very simply. His writing's not flowery, but it's evocative and really descriptive and very atmospheric. So I always love a good John Searle's novel.
He baits you along. He definitely pulls the bait constantly. You feel like you're a little mouse, like following the cheese. You definitely do.
Absolutely. And you're thinking like, and you're not even like, when you read something and you're like, you come to the end and they're not connected and you feel like, that's a ripoff. Like that was a real bait and switch. He does not, that he is such a confident writer that you are down for the ride. No matter where it ends up, you're like, I'm going to follow you because I just love your writing so much.
One of the things I miss working about in the city is he used to work at Cosmo, which is a block away from our office. And we would meet on the street and gossip. And he will say to this day, what he misses, like we'd run into the seat after lunch and just start talking, blah, 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 blah. And he was just so much fun to chat with because he was the best.
A great storyteller.
Yes.
He's
Let's
wonderful.
just gossip along. And he worked with Kate White, who was also an author. So you could just picture the 2 of them talking about their work besides talking about writing great cover lines for Cosmo.
So that is the one thing I miss about commuting and working in the city is you do miss those little last minute gossip sessions on the street.
Yeah. Toughly gossiping away.
So now we move on to some nonfiction. Your next book is Unmasked, My Life Solving America's Cold Cases by Paul Holes, which sounds pretty fascinating. So tell us about it.
It's amazing. I'm a huge true crime fan. Well, it sounds weird to say fan of crime, but I'm really into that genre. And he is such an amazing person. And his thing, I think if anybody knows of him, I first came to know of him as I would listen to this podcast called My Favorite Murder. And he was one of the guests on it. And he's a former detective who now kind of just devotes himself completely to working on cold cases. And one of the highest profile one that he worked on was the Golden State Killer. And he had worked with Michelle McNamara, the late Michelle McNamara, who was working on her book, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, but sadly passed away in 2016 while she was working on it. Paul was one of the people that she was working with. The other people, there was 2 other people who came together, finished the book. And I think maybe a year after her death, through a DNA ancestry site, they got a DNA match and they found out who the Golden State Killer was and was able to arrest him. So that was the highest profile case he's worked on. but he's worked on so many. He's, I think it's Contra Costa County in Northern California. And I just want to send him to the University of Idaho and solve this case, because you know he could. And I'm fascinated by that case too. And he just has a great way of, he's like that person you'd meet at a bar, and over whiskey, he would tell you this crazy case that he worked on, and you would be hooked and hanging on every word. He's just another great storyteller. And he's very just, you could tell he loves his job. He's had a couple of marriages. He's had 2 kids that he wished he spent a little more time with. And he talks about that as well. It's like the price of the job. He so was about the job and the case at hand that a lot of his life maybe was neglected a little bit. So he's just a fascinating writer, and he has his own podcast that he hosts called Murder Squad with Billy Jensen. That's another one.
Oh, I've got to listen to that. I've got to listen to that. I'm fascinated by true crime. And I'm fascinated by what they can do now with DNA and what they can really find out.
Unbelievable how many cases are being solved now. And he's really good looking. He's very easy on the eyes, which is a nice little point when you're talking about such horrific stuff. It's really
there you
nice.
go. There's good. He's going to get the story out of you. You're the witness. So your final title is Endless Summer by Ellen Hildebrand. So why did you enjoy this one so much, besides the fact we all want an endless summer? Like, let's just go there.
Right? And this is the one I do have the cover for.
Okay.
The other 2 I like, one was for the library and one I gave away. But Ellen Hildebrand, I mean, whenever I see a book with her name and a bluish cover, it's usually in the summer, in June. And you're like, new Ellen Hildebrand for my beach bag. This one pubbed in the fall. But it's such an interesting thing. And I would love the way it's kind of defies genre. You don't need to be an Ellen Hildebrand fan or have read all her other works, because this is a series of, it's called, the subtitle is Stories from Days That Last Forever. And what she's done, which I think is so interesting, she's gone back to previous novels, written extra chapters, did a little prequel, did like a sequel story for some, brand new things that have never been published before from her private notes about like, I wish I could go back and kind of just follow this storyline and see what happened to these 2 people. And I almost wish that more writers would do this, because it would be so interesting to see, if you had to revisit one of your old works, how would you change it? How would you add to it or redefine it? And it's just really great. And if you don't know Ellen Hildebrand, it's a great place to start, because it really gives you a heads up of what her writing is like and the stories that she tells. And they're mostly set in Nantucket, where she's from. And they draw you in, and you're just ready to go sit on a beach chair for hours and just not talk to anybody and just lose yourself in her stories. So that's why I've always been a fan of hers, but this was such an interesting way to highlight her works. So for that, it was one of my favorites.
You know, it's interesting. She said that after 2024, she's not going to write anymore. She's not going to be writing any more fiction. She's planning to walk away from it. And I find that a very interesting thing for an author at this part of their career.
She's going to do that. But you know what? She's got, I've always envied her writing style. She would go and rent a place in like Beacon Hill in Boston and just like write. And then she would go to St. Thomas, I guess pre-COVID. I don't know if she's done, I think she's done it since COVID, for a month in the winter and just write for that month. Who doesn't want that schedule?
Who doesn't want that life?
Sign me up. I want it. But I think I just don't know how she can. I know she has, children, and they're getting older, and maybe she wants to spend more time with her family, but
she wants an endless summer for herself too, because let's face it. But I think that something that she's doing there with writing stories, and I've talked to a lot of authors about this, is every author, I think, when they finish a book, has got a chapter they put aside, a character that didn't make it or whatever. And I feel that there's this fabulous play that they can either do with an Audible original or an audio original. Let's just say an audio original, or add that story to their website and have people be able to go back and visit and make the website be something more. And it's almost like I'd like to do a podcast with, tell me the story that you still wanted to write, but you never did. Because there's so much material that gets X'd out and doesn't make it, but it's still great storytelling.
And it still could add to that experience, like the way R.J. Palacio did with Wonder.
Yes.
And they went back with the other character, the bully story, which was, I think, a Kindle original or something that she came out with later. And I remember my book group reading Wonder, and then we all read the supplemental chapter as well. And that really informed how we felt about it, which was, it's so interesting. So I applaud her for doing this. And I hope more writers do stuff like this because it is really interesting. And she has a great section in here where she talks about one thing was excised on the advice of her editor. And she was just saying, to show you that I do listen and I do compromise, here's this.
What I did.
But you got to get it right back in anyway. So
people were asking for the title. It's Endless Summer.
Endless Summer. I'll show up the cover one more time. Endless Summer, stories from the days that last forever.
Definitely sounds like, for people who aren't familiar with her work, you'll then be able to go back and you'd be interested in reading all those past stories or, what the other alternate ending is if you haven't read it. So it's like, it just sounds so fascinating.
I think I said that in my review. I think I said it's like a primer for Ellen Hildenbrand. Like if you aren't sure what she's like, it's a great way to start too. And then if you're a fan, it's just more of what you love about her.
Yeah. Yeah. And it came out in October, which I found was really interesting too. A summer book in October.
And then she's been doing the winter books too. So all seasons owned by Ellen Hildenbrand.
All seasons owned by Ellen Hildenbrand. Bronwyn, thank you. So good to see you again.
So good to see you guys. Have a wonderful night. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being with us. So Kate Ayers is joining us tonight. Kate retired from a career as a court reporter in the Pacific Northwest, and she now enjoys the bulk of her time traveling and writing. I've got to share, years ago, I went out and I met up with Kate. I think I was in Portland. I'm not sure. I think so. And we drove around in her, what car was it? What kind of car did you have? It was
Smart.
Yes. And I would just,
Smart.
and I sat there going, oh my gosh, this is like so much fun. We're right up on the street. Please drive carefully. So it was so much fun. It's nice to see her again after all this time. She's completed novels in her Mysteries with the Wine List series and 2 in her Eyes and Ears series, and she's currently working on another. So we have a reviewer who is also a writer. So absolutely love that. And it's been fun to see her work through the years as well. So she's going to start out talking about The Maze, which is by my pal Nelson DeMille. And John Corey is very much like Nelson DeMille. It's kind of like his persona, if I may say. So you tell us about The Maze.
Yeah, I'll pick anything by Nelson DeMille. If he writes it, I'll read it. He's my favorite author, absolutely. And I think John Corey is my favorite character. The Plum Island is where he introduced John Corey, and I think there are 6 other novels between Plum Island and The Maze. And in The Maze, he goes back to Long Island to his uncle's house, which is a great big beautiful Victorian that's on the Sound. And I mean, he's just kind of hanging out there, and his friend Chief Maxwell decides to kind of give him a nudge to take this job at Security Solutions, which he doesn't really want a job. And Beth, his kind of love interest that's in and out all the way from Plum Island, she kind of gives him a nudge too, and he kind of gets a little suspicious as to why do you want me to, have a job? So he takes it because he's thinking there's something going on here. And of course, John is such he's suspicious. He's really, really smart. And he loves danger. So he wants to get in there and find out what's wrong. He thinks there's something criminal going on. And of course there is. So it's a really fun book because, of course, again, he gets into all sorts of tight spots, and he's just a wisecracker all the way through. So you're just giggling as you're clutching your heart through the whole thing. So that's what I love about DeMille and John Corey.
John Corey is irreverent. John Corey will say whatever's on his mind. If he looks at a woman, he definitely sees the attributes of a woman in a whole very different way, guys. Like he's in that guy language, and you're in his head the entire time. So when he walks in a room, you see everybody in that room from his perspective, and you're in his head the whole novel. And that's the kind of thing where he's very irreverent. He's very not, let's put say, today he would be very objectionable. He would definitely be in trouble in the office for anything
yeah.
that he said and did. So he's like out there as the bad boy. And if you just go in knowing that's what
Yeah.
happened, you're fine with John Corey, you know?
I just want to meet him.
I'll introduce you to Nelson. There you
I
go.
really want to meet him.
So now, Kate, you have another thriller on your list, December 41 by William Martin. So what can you tell us about that?
I read this a long time ago, so it's a little fuzzier. And part of it is I really like character-driven stories. And this one is not as much as like John Corey and DeMille, but it is to a certain extent in that it's got a lot of characters and they're very fully developed. It's fun in that it kind of starts in Hollywood in it's December of 41, as you might guess. And it's right when the announcement comes that Pearl Harbor has been attacked. Well, the Germans are training in Hollywood there. They're shooting, and there's a guy there named Martin Brown who is planning to shoot FDR at the lighting of the Christmas tree. So it all kind of flows from there. And you have, of course, the fun of Hollywood where you've got a script reader and you've got a few aspiring actresses and you've got these people that are involved trying to get ahead and do things. And a couple of them play into the whole thing. They decide it's not working out in Hollywood, so they get on the same, what is it, the Super Chief? And they go east and they're on the same train with this Martin Brown, who is going to assassinate the president. Well, the good thing is there's a very astute porter on board named Stanley. So we get to see what Stanley does to make sure that he pays attention to what's going on. And so by the time they get there, there's a lot of chaos, a lot of twists. There are a lot of things that go on. And all of these people play parts that, of course, they probably wanted to play back in Hollywood, but they didn't get a chance to. It's really a lot of fun with a lot of twists. And in fact, I'd like to go back and read it again because I've forgotten a lot of the little details, and there are a lot of them. And it's fun and scary.
It was one of our Father's Day give-away books. I remember that. And they came into us and I was like, this book sounds really interesting because it's not history per se. It's history with the thriller element to it. And you don't see a lot of that. You see like serious history.
Yeah, it's not, but it's fun to learn a little bit as you go because I'm really stupid about history. Great to learn something.
And so, Kate, your last pick is So Long, Chester Wheeler by Catherine Ryan Hyde. So talk a little bit about that one.
This book is a killer. It's absolutely, to me, it's the best book I've read in a very long time. Chester Wheeler, again, I like character-driven books. Chester Wheeler is just a homophobic, nasty old coot. And unfortunately, his neighbor is a very nice young gay man. And he's having a really, really hard time. Chester sees Lewis, the gay neighbor. He sees Lewis's love interest drive off. And he starts slinging all these insults across the street. And he's just horrible. Well, it turns out that Chester is dying and he has a lot of baggage. And nobody in Buffalo can stand Chester. So he only gets a caretaker for a day, maybe two, because they can't stand him. Even his kids can't stand him. They just hate Chester because he's just so awful. And it turns out that Lewis really, really needs a job. And he gets desperate enough that he takes the job of caretaker. So the dynamics between these two, it's what they learn from each other. And especially since Chester decides he divorced his wife 32 years ago, and he has some things he wants to say to her. So he wants Lewis to drive him to Arizona in the Winnebago. And that's just a really, really interesting trip, as you might figure. So to me, it's cathartic for the two men. It's cathartic for the reader. It's just the most amazing story about what Chester learns and what Lewis learns about himself, and what the reader learns about themselves. It's great. I can't recommend it enough.
It makes a huge difference when you actually get to sit down and, learn about these people, like talk to them, and not just, the outside perception of them. It's really important.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It was a beautiful book.
A couple of people are asking that they can't see the titles of the books as well, because people don't have there. You do have that book if you want to hold that one up. A lot of the reviewers today are telling us that they don't have the covers of the book because they've given the books away, or they've gone back to the library, or they're not with them where they are. So
I have both of these.
Okay, so December 41.
The maze I don't have because I loaned it.
Yeah, I was going to grab the maze off my shelf. I was going to grab it. What we'll do is, I think, Tom, what we'll do at the end is we'll put a collage of the titles together. Let's do it that way instead of trying to just drop them in the video. Let's put a collage of them together so that people will be able to see them that way, which will have us be able to get the video out faster. I originally thought about dropping them into each video, but let's go for the easier way. Let's go for the easier way.
Right.
And everyone, about an hour before the show started, I sent an email out that had the list of all the books mentioned. So anybody who's looking for it, if you were registered before 7:00, you have a list of it because I sent it out then. So just know that. And what we'll do is in the notes down below, we'll include that list as well, so that you'll be able to download that too. Okay. Tom, you're up.
Thank you so much, Kate. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Kate. Great
to have you here. All right. So next up, we have Sarah Rachel Egelman, who lives in New Mexico, where she's a professor of religion and humanities. She also works and teaches in the Albuquerque Jewish community. She enjoys writing, knitting, spending time outdoors, and especially reading, of course. Great to have you here, Sarah.
Hey, nice to see everybody.
I wish I was going to that yarn store with you again that we went to when we were in Albuquerque. I was like dying. I still get their emails, and I remembered the day we spent there. It's such a good time, really such a good time. The yarn, probably not.
I just finished a sweater this week that I started 2 years ago, March 2020, when I thought I'll be home for a couple weeks. So, it's a slow hobby.
Yeah, well, it's like the loom I have to learn to weave that I got in January 2020. I've had a lot of free time, a lot of free time. So earlier, Norah talked about tomorrow, and you also picked this book of one of your favorites. So we heard what she said. You tell us why you loved it.
All right, and I do have it here. Beautiful cover. This is on a lot of the best book of the year lists for very good reason. And Norah described it really well. So I'll just sort of recap what she shared. It's the story of two friends, Sadie and Sam, and they meet in this hospital visiting room. They bond over a love of video games. They reunite as young adults and go into business together, designing video games. They actually bring another friend, a guy named Marks Watanabe, into business with them. And he sort of moderates their genius and loves them both, even though they are really tempestuous and difficult sort of genius personalities. He brings out the best in them. So in some ways, it's it's the story of this duo, but a trio as well. So their first video game that they produced together is wildly successful. But of course, the success comes at great costs. And the book is really about this friendship, but also sort of about the creative impulse. And Zevin is so skilled and clever, and she explores so much in this book, really gender and again, creativity and friendship and partnership and different kinds of love. She throws in a lot of game theory and design theory. It's threaded with all this pop culture and also a lot of the poetry of Emily Dickinson, which is just a delight to find in this book. So I would say it's sort of a contemporary epic. It just really has so much in it, but she has absolute control over it. So it ends up being really readable and immersive, which is, the way a good video game is as well, right? You're just really in this world that she's created. So it's really geeky and it's beautiful and sort of all these messy truths. And one cool thing is one of the early games that Sadie designs in the novel, you can find online. So if you go to Zevin's website, you can find her little game that she designed when this character was a college student. So you can actually play one of the games in the book. It really deserves to be on everyone's list this year.
I think it's the Barnes and Noble book of the year. I think it was the Barnes and Noble book. Yes. Am I right? Or is it? Or no, wait, that was Lessons in Chemistry. Wait, that was Lessons in Chemistry. Somebody's book of the year. Oh, I'm losing my mind. Sorry.
Definitely one.
So many books. Yeah.
Definitely a book of the year. Yeah.
So what can you share about your next pick, This Time Tomorrow by Emma Straub, which is just such a personal story to her?
Oh, this is amazing. So this is another beautiful cover here, This Time Tomorrow. And both books with tomorrow in them. I am not usually a fan of time travel stories at all, but This Time Tomorrow is so good. And Straub really makes the implausible work in telling her story. So begins with a woman named Alice Stern, and it's the night before she turns 40 years old. She goes to her father's house and ends up sort of sleeping off a night of drinking in his garden shed. And she wakes up and it's her 16th birthday. So she's time traveled back. And Alice's father, whose name is Leonard Stern, is in the present day in her 40th year. He's dying. But back in 1996, when she is 16, she can spend time with him again. So it's time that she thought when she was a teenager, the first time she was living through it, she thought it was complicated in these particular ways, but from her adult perspective, she's just happy to have this time. And she uses it in a number of ways to learn more about her father, the reasons he raised her like he did. She learns more about the best-selling book that he wrote that provided for them financially. And she goes back and forth in time, sort of making alterations to her life because she feels in the present sort of stuck. But what she really wants to do is save her father's life. So she keeps trying to find the thing in the past that will extend his life into the future. And this is such a lovely, sweet, funny, really wise, I don't know, all the good words, elegant, heartbreaking novel about mortality and choice and fathers and daughters who really don't get enough books written about them. And both Alice and Leonard are these really great characters. They feel really real despite, the time travel mechanism that Straub uses. And of course, Emma Straub's own father, the great novelist Peter Straub, died pretty soon after this book was published, which for me made the story feel even more immediate and impactful because I had really fallen in love with these characters and loved this book. And I'm a fan of both of the father and daughter in real life. And then when he died, it really gave a different spin to the book that I'd read. I see in the chat, it's called This Time Tomorrow. And my own daughter read it after I did, and she took it from me because she fell in love with it too. And we each found something in it really different about family, about growing up, about time, because we were reading it at different points in our life, which indicates to me that it's a rereadable book, which I think is always something to look for in a story, something that you could come back to again and again. So I had to borrow it back from her today, but it's a great story.
You know, it was interesting. Her dad was sick a couple of years ago, which inspired her writing this book. And she's thinking about, oh, if my dad wasn't here, like, you know, but if I could go back in time. And then to have her father pass away after he got a chance to read the book. The book came out in the spring. He passed away, and I guess it was August or September. I think it was the end of August. And you're just sitting there and you're saying, oh my gosh, but at least he had the chance to read what she felt about the whole experience. So I don't know.
Just makes the experience that much more poignant.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely beautiful.
And so now your last selection is Unmask Alice by Rick Emerson.
Yeah, so here's this creepy cover. For this third pick, I wanted to choose something besides a novel. And so I kind of went through all the non-novels that I read this year. I read a great horror anthology, some good biographies, and I settled on Unmask Alice by Rick Emerson because it was a book that the whole time I was reading it, I was sort of exclaiming out loud. I was like, no way, oh my goodness, the whole time, and telling everyone who would listen all about it. And I'd first heard an interview with Rick Emerson on the You're Wrong About podcast. So I sort of knew where this book was going to go, and reading it, I enjoyed it, even though I sort of knew the basic outlines. So Emerson investigates in this book the famous, or I guess infamous, 1971 diary of a teen girl named Alice. So Go Ask Alice. And this was purportedly a real diary that was edited by a woman named Beatrice Sparks, who was an aspiring writer from Utah. And the big reveal here is that the diary was fake. Sparks, it was fraudulent, and this fraud had just sort of untold impact on American culture, creating this like unfounded panic about sex and drugs and Satanism amongst American teens, where people were just, freaking out. And this is a book that's the book that Emerson is writing about, Go Ask Alice, is still found in even school libraries today. And Sparks took some real life tragic stories from teens that she knew or she heard about who were suffering from really very real challenges, but mostly she fabricated that diary, as well as later other diaries that she said she found. And some publishers and journalists and teachers and others were hoodwinked by her books, but others saw her books as a way to profit, even when they sort of realized that it wasn't all true or not true in the way that she presented it. But Emerson's story, sort of unpacking Sparks's life and what her motivation could have been and how people responded in American culture to Go Ask Alice, it really results in this almost unbelievable story. It's infuriating, it's sad, it's disturbing on a lot of levels. It reads kind of like a true crime book because it has that investigative sensibility to it. And for as dark as it is, it's just wildly entertaining. It's a nonfiction book about fiction posing as nonfiction. So it's just a wild ride. I really enjoyed it a lot.
Especially since that book was so popular. It was just so popular, and remember that.
Yeah, it shows up, all over pop culture, and it's sort of a touchstone in 70s and through the 80s, really. And to find out that, and it impacted people in all these really weird ways, and to find out it was just fake, it was just made up, is fascinating.
Like part of our childhood has to be brought back. Our teenhood has to be brought back as a result.
Yeah.
So great to see you again. Keep on knitting. I want to see what you make.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me.
Great to see you again. Next up, we've got Harvey Freedenberg, who has been practiced intellectual property law and litigation with a large Harrisburg, Pennsylvania firm before he retired in 2017. Really? That long ago? I feel like it was yesterday, Harvey. He's been working as a freelance reviewer since 2005 and is a member of the National Book Critics Circle with good reason. He writes for Book Page, Shelf Awareness, Kirkus Reviews, as well as for us. So Harvey, tell us about your first selection, Tasha, A Son's Memoir by Brian Morton.
Well, sometimes we're called upon to review books, and the reaction is that this book would have been great if it was half as long. This is a memoir that I wish could have gone on for another 100 pages or so. It barely clocks in at 200 pages. Brian Morton is an outstanding fiction writer. He has the tag of being a writer's writer, so his books unfortunately don't sell a lot, but a couple of them have been made into movies. One was called Starting Out in the Evening. So he's primarily a fiction writer, but this is a story about his mother, Tasha. The story starts out in the mid-'80s, in her mid-'80s, and we discover her in a car that's about to be washed away in a flood. So it begins in an atmosphere of crisis, and the memoir traces her decline over a period of several years before she dies. She is really an incredible character. She's feisty. She's opinionated. She was a school teacher for many years. And for all of her outward bluster, shall we say, he discovers after her death, when he finds some journals that she had kept, that she really had been suffering from depression for a good part of her life. Her husband passed away about 30 years before her death. She didn't remarry. And so she had this constant internal struggle, which really never surfaced in the course of her life. So Morton goes back and forth tracing her life story and her current circumstances, but he also takes a look at himself and really is constantly questioning the way he responds to his mother's situation, alternating between feeling that he's doing enough for her to take care of her, and then feeling guilty, of course, in trying to satisfy her growing needs. And it's also sort of an indictment of the way we take care of the elderly in the United States. He says that it's very difficult to find reliable care. There are a couple of really harrowing stories about caretakers that they hire to come into her home, and some verbal abuse that takes place in the home. So it's quite startling in that respect. And it's the kind of story that if you've read Roz Chast's Can't We Talk About Anything More Pleasant, which was a graphic memoir about her aging parents, it's the kind of story that you're going to be laughing uproariously on one page, and a page or two later, you're going to be crying. Mm-hmm. So he really plays a very strong range of emotions and does it quite beautifully.
Mm.
Definitely sounds like a book that a lot of people can relate to.
Yeah,
for sure.
Especially really to get good care. Good care for the elderly is so difficult because, first of all, it's expensive. Second of all, you have no idea what's really going on unless you're there 24/7, because often the other person can't even tell you. And it's also learning that you can't really get 24-hour care. It's really 3 8-hour shifts. And you learn these kinds of things when you get plucked into these situations. And it's just harrowing to sit there and say, you're going to be in your later years, and this is what we have to worry about.
And of course, he has his own family. So he's a member of what's been termed the sandwich generation. And he's struggling with the burdens of being a parent and a husband, along with being a caretaker for his mother. So he's in quite a predicament. But it's not a polemic. The story just unfolds very naturally, and it's just beautiful. He's a fantastic writer. So I was excited about this one, and on my list of favorites of the year, this is actually number one.
Wow, great.
Now, Harvey, next up is the George Saunders book, Liberation Day, which I know Eileen talked about earlier. So what are your thoughts on this one?
I love George Saunders. I've loved him for a long time. And I had the pleasure of hearing him speak here in Harrisburg when his novel Lincoln in the Bardo was published a few years ago. And he's just a fascinating character. He's just a warm-hearted, kindly, gentle, funny kind of person. So it's whenever I hear he's doing a podcast, if I can find it, I'll listen to him whenever he's on. So this is a collection of 9 short stories, and I really was interested in this because, in addition to my long-term love of his work, He wrote a nonfiction book last year, which I reviewed for Book Reporter. It was called A Swim in a Pond in the Rain, where he analyzed 7 short stories by Russian short story masters like Tolstoy and Chekhov, and talked about the craft of writing the short story. So it was fun coming from that book last year to this collection to see how he implemented some of the techniques that he talked about. And he really does it beautifully. I think it was Eileen who mentioned that there are 3 or 4 stories in this that are kind of dystopian stories. And he has a technique where he just drops you into the middle of a situation on the first page and you're completely at sea. And as the story proceeds, you gradually get your footing and everything comes into focus. That's true of the title story, Liberation Day. But there are also stories that are set in very recognizable circumstances. There's a story called Sparrow, which involves 2 employees at a grocery store who are both kind of misfits who fall in love with each other. And there's another story called Love Letter, which is in the form of a letter from a grandfather to a grandson sometime in this decade, commenting on a dystopian politics that sound very much like the politics of our day, and sort of justifying the grandfather's behavior and at the same time apologizing to the grandson for not being more of an activist under these circumstances. And if you look for this on Google, Stephen Colbert, or on you can Google this. Stephen Colbert does a reading of this story, a dramatic reading of the story that I think you can find on YouTube, which is definitely worth looking for. So Saunders in the Russian short story book talks about stories being moral instruments, and he doesn't moralize, but they're really very subtle, gentle moral lessons in a lot of these stories, and that's one of the reasons why I find his writing so appealing.
Fantastic.
Great to have your perspective on that one. And so now your final pick is Dirtbag, Massachusetts by Isaac Fitzgerald. So what drew you to this one?
Well, it's another memoir, a memoir in essays, which I think was also true of the Sarah Polley book. Oftentimes in a memoir, as good as it might be, there's sort of a uniform tone to the memoir, and particularly where it's a dark one, you get to the point where you say, what else can happen to this person? And it almost becomes difficult to get through the memoir. There's certainly a lot of dark moments in this memoir. There's abuse at an early age. He admits that he started drinking alcohol and using drugs and engaging in petty theft when he was 12 years old, and fortunately made it into a boarding school at age 14, which he said really started him on a road to rescue. But he's had a lot of difficulties in his life, and yet at the same time, that's balanced with some really warm-hearted stories about friendships and relationships that he's had. Many of them center around a bar in San Francisco called Zeitgeist, which apparently is a well-known bar there where he worked for a time. And he tells the story of one of the bartenders there who became a close friend. So it's a nice balance between the darkness and the light of his life. And he also has some really fascinating personal experiences. He worked in Burma for a year working for an NGO that was helping a rebel group in Burma, and he was driving supplies across the border. And he went over there with literally no idea of what he was going to do. And he finds himself in the middle of this very dangerous situation. He briefly worked as an extra in pornographic films in San Francisco. So he's barely 40 years old, and he's just had a real assortment of life experiences. So I'm hoping that there's another memoir forthcoming from him in the future, because I'm sure, based on what he's written here, that it's going to be very interesting. Quite an interesting fellow, and quite well written.
And also doesn't understand he's going to be following one path going forward. So you're going to be able to zig and zag with him later as well.
He's been all over the place, and he admits that he's very much a work in progress.
Very much a work in progress.
Sounds like a second memoir would be just as action-packed as this one, based off of
Yes.
everything that has happened to him so far.
Yes, I think so.
That's great. Somebody's asking who the author is. It's Isaac Fitzgerald. No
Yes.
relative.
Okay.
Thank you so much for joining us. Always love to hear
Okay.
your picks. Always love
Thanks
to
for
hear
having me.
Harvey.
Thank you.
So Rebecca Munro is joining us next, and she's a project editor at W.W. Norton and Company, and a member of the Morristown Festival of Books Programming Committee, where she's also has moderated panels. Prior to joining Norton, she was a very familiar face to all of us at Book Reporter because she's the editorial manager of our Teen Reads and our Kids Reads websites. And she is currently living in New Hampshire. And Rebecca joins us now with her beautifully decorated Christmas tree behind her.
Thank you, Carol.
It is the season.
Tis
Great
the
to have
season.
you,
Here we
Rebecca.
go. Good to see you, Rebecca. It's one of those people you used to see like in the next office, like all day long. And now you're like, oh, up on the screen. There you go.
So now, Rebecca, let's start with your first pick, which is The Measure by Nicol Ehrlich.
Okay, this is my very favorite book of the year, if not the last few years. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, it starts with this very science fiction-y premise. One day, everyone in the world over the age of 22 wakes up to a box outside their door with a string in it. The strings are different lengths, unbreakable, and no one knows what's going on. Is it aliens? Is it terrorists? Is it teenage pranksters? We don't know. But as it goes on and as the government start investigating and people start investigating, we determine that it is the measure of one's life. So there are short stringers, people who are nearing the end of their lives very soon, and long stringers who have a lot of life to go. That's all well and good, but what really kicks it off is the fact that it changes the way people approach their lives, each other, their politics, their governments, their education, everything like that. So we have on one hand this really like personal story. What does it mean? Is my life coming to an end? Is it not? But then it starts to expand into this very global political worldview. So we follow 8 characters, each with different strings, some of whom refuse to look at theirs because they just don't want to know. A very valid decision in my humble opinion. Others who are couples who maybe have totally different lengths, and it changes all their personal relationships. But as it grows and gets this kind of global following, governments start to change, insurance policy lenders start to change, medical officials start to change. So it becomes a case of, we have 12 people in the yard tonight, but 5 of them have short strings. Who are we going to focus on? And naturally, short stringers in the world become very angry and volatile, and they are quickly typecast in the media as dangerous. And this goes on for everything. People looking to adopt who can no longer adopt because they have short strings. People looking for mortgages or loans to start businesses. And I'm making it sound truly depressing and very political. But what Nicol Ehrlich really does well is that it becomes so much more about the people and how they respond and how they kind of reprioritize their lives, what they look at, what relationships they build. And it's so beautiful. There are 8 characters, like I said. There's a doctor who has spent his life believing that he can sort of beat death and has to learn very quickly that he cannot. There's a beautiful queer couple who think they have forever and find out that they do not. There's also a really nice young architect who finds out he has a very short string and doesn't want to burden his family with the knowledge. So as these 8 characters kind of grapple with their own lifespans and mortalities, they come together in these beautiful, beautiful ways. Their stories are tied together in ways I couldn't have predicted. Nicol Ehrlich has a really, really masterful hold over plot lines, and it is just the most life-affirming, positive book I think I've ever read, as depressing as I made it sound. And I think as we're gearing up for the holidays, whatever you celebrate or don't celebrate, or looking at the new year, I think we could all kind of stand to take measure of our lives. And this book just does it beautifully. I have hand sold it to so many friends, neighbors. I am always out in my local places just recommending this book, and everyone has loved it.
It's one of those ones I've wanted to read. I haven't had time to read, but I also say it'd be a great book club book because it can see
100%.
everybody in the book club. And it's one of those books, there was a book out that was a couple of years ago that was like, you were going to find out how long you would live. Like, would you want to know how long you would live? And I think that that kind of a question coming to people is a great opener of, do you want to know or don't you want to know? So somebody's saying Julia Whalen narrated the audio for The Measure, and she's a really, really good narrator. So that would make it really even more amazing. Well, Rebecca and I usually like the same books, like a lot of times. And our next book is The Things We Do in the Dark by Jennifer Hillier, which is one of my bets on selections as well. So tell me about it, because tell everybody about it, because I love this book.
I love this book. I'm going to confess to all of you that this was a sneaky kind of pick for me because I love everything she writes. So this is me recommending her entire backlist, but especially this one. So Jennifer Hillier is this like tremendous voice in suspense fiction. She is a meticulous plotter, and she has such an assured hand of her plots, what she writes. So in this one, it starts pretty gory and messy. We meet a young woman named Paris Peralta, and she is a young, gorgeous Filipino woman married to kind of a curmudgeonly older comedian who has recently kind of reemerged onto the scene. He had like most comedians, had a background in substance abuse and is just now really coming back. And just as he is poised to make his great return, he is found murdered, and she wakes up really near the body, blood everywhere, weapon visible. I mean, we know the story. And of course, being 20 years his junior, she is quickly accused. And that's awful. But like every protagonist in every thriller, she has a dark past. And at the same time that this is unfolding, she receives a letter in the mail from a penitentiary in Canada. There is this famous, infamous, notorious female killer in Canada who is being released. And as much as she's ready to get back into the world and tell her story, she also really wants to talk to Paris, because Paris killed her daughter years ago. And as these two plot lines unfold, you get Paris's past, you get this ice killer's past, the truth about what happened to her daughter. But what I really love, I think we see these dual storylines in thrillers a lot, right? But Jennifer has such a confident, assured hold of each storyline. You really get two novels in one. Mm-hmm. And that's what I keep saying about this one. It is two connected, but entirely fleshed out and fulfilling thriller plot lines in one, which is immensely difficult, I can imagine. And I think a lot of my fellow panelists can probably agree. The more you write reviews, the more you read, you kind of get more critical. Mm-hmm. I don't like to have the sense typically that the author was working really hard. And when I read Jennifer, I have the sense that she loves what she is doing. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it touches on, like I said, substance abuse, celebrity, paparazzi, childhood abuse, all these horrifically dark things, but none of it is gratuitous. She backs up every single reveal with just this fine-tuned character development. She is incredible.
Yeah, I agree. It was just terrifically done. And it was the story that you didn't know where it was going to go. Like at the beginning, you're like, oh, I got what's going on. But you realize you're on page like 3. So there's no way it's that short a book. So I completely agree with you.
Right. And even though it starts with the murder, it gets creepier.
Yes, if it's possible.
Not easy to do or say or read at times, but it's so worth it. If you like thrillers, or anyone in your life likes thrillers, this is the Christmas present.
It was like Claire McIntosh's The Last Party. I feel like it was like the same thing, where it's a reveal, twist, reveal, and you're just sitting there like, right. And it's right at the beginning, they get you. Like, it's really those first couple of pages. Yeah. And you really say, okay, well, how is this going to get better? And it does. And that's when they don't disappoint. It's great.
Absolutely.
Now, your third selection is another one that I haven't read, Remarkably Bright Creatures by Shelby Van Pelt, which I missed reading this year. Lisa Hickman, who's our contest coordinator, swears it's one of her favorite books of the year. So tell us about what you loved about it.
So again, I noticed my picks this year, beside the thriller, are a little more whimsical than I tend to go. But this just backs it up entirely. It's perfect. So this book starts being narrated by a very curmudgeonly, angry and critical octopus. If I lost you there, I get it. But this octopus lives in an aquarium, and he is, I mean, as we probably all know from National Geographic, octopuses are really smart. And he has been watching the humans around him, learning their fingerprints, learning their patterns, learning their scents, from the kid who comes every year on their birthday party to the tour guides who kind of struggle with remembering their facts. He knows everything. And he is not impressed by humans. They are not remarkably bright like himself. The one human, though, who has really started to grow on him is Toba, and she is the 70-year-old cleaner of the aquarium. Now, she's older, but she shows up every day with eagerness and ready-to-go-ness, and she loves what she does, and she's really fulfilled by it. And he watches her, and he just really likes watching her, and she comes and talks to him every night. And you think, she has this great animal friendship, and that is true. But in her real life, she's lost her husband really traumatically, and her son went missing many years ago when he was only 18. And that has kind of stagnated her. She has a knitting group, the Knitwits, great name, and she does this job to a T, but she's really stuck. And as she's getting older, she kind of has to figure out, well, can't work here forever. I might have to downsize. What does that mean? At the same time, however, our angry octopus friend is nearing the end of his lifespan. And he knows this because it's pretty clear things are slowing down. His color is not changing as fast. And he really wants to get back to the ocean, obviously. But on top of that, he knows what happened to Toba's son all those years ago. And he makes it his life's mission, end of his life's mission, to tell her so she can have closure and he can feel like he really lived a full life. At the same time, there's a young man who comes to this area looking for his past and inevitably his future. And as the three of them come together, they're all facing these grand life questions. What is the meaning of my life? What have I chosen for myself? Am I happy with it? And they're at such different points. Obviously, one is an octopus, but one is a young man, one is an old woman. And the fact that Shelby can really highlight, I don't want to say coming of age, but coming of end of age, and make their journeys feel so similar, but so unique to each other. It's just so well done. It's so whimsical and fun, but then she really backs it up with the tenderness and the journey of a life. She goes into each life, she gives them each equal weight, and it's just so whimsical and fun. The observations of humans from a third party obviously are fantastic, if a little embarrassing, but it's really fantastic. Just whimsical and bright and really hopeful in the end.
Okay, so you didn't have me at octopus, but I think you got me at the rest of it. And I always stopped on the octopus. It's probably that
That's
octopus.
a tough sell.
It was just like, really the octopus? Everyone's going, you love this book. I'm like, I want the octopus. Carol, it's about more than the octopus, just seriously,
So much more. And, I heard a few other panelists say they're attracted to like character-driven novels or anything like that. This is my year of voice-driven novels, and the voice in this, if you loved Girl with a Louding Voice, any other voicey novels that everyone loves, I mean, you'll just be so drawn to this immediately.
Okay, convinced. All right, I'll be finding it. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for joining us. Thanks for decorating that tree to get us in the spirit of the season. Good to see you.
All right, now our next guest is Pamela Kramer. And Pam was a lawyer for many years and is retired from her job as a dual language gifted teacher in Highland Park, Illinois. Pamela enjoyed combining her love of books and her love of animals with her teaching. Through her website, she is able to recommend books, including picture books and middle grade and young adult books, to teachers and librarians. Because of her background, she often includes tips for using the books in the classroom. She also reads many adult books and loves sharing those on social media and her blog. So great to have you with us, Pam.
I have to say I'm super frustrated because I'm just taking notes of all the books that people are recommending that now I want to go read and I don't have time.
That's the danger of being involved
books
in
on
one
my
of these
shelf.
events.
I'm like, I've already got the guilt of what I didn't finish this year. And then there's the real guilt of like, oh, this is coming next year. Have you read it yet? And I'm like, no. In trouble, behind.
So now, Pam, we heard Kate talk about Catherine Ryan Hyde's latest novel that just came out this week, So Long, Chester Wheeler. But you picked another Catherine Ryan Hyde book that came out earlier this year, Dreaming of Flight. So tell us about that one.
I did. And I was actually, I was surprised because I hadn't seen it on the list of books to review for December, but now I'm really happy because I can still read that one and share Dreaming of Flight, which came out, I think, in May, maybe. But I'm just a huge fan of Catherine Ryan Hyde, and I've reviewed many of her books. And I'm all about books and animals, and so is she. And many of her books talk about the human and animal connection. In her book Stay and Seven Perfect Things, that's really important. When I started Dreaming of Flight, I realized that the main character is an 11-year-old boy. And you can see on the cover, he's holding a chicken in his arms. I did pass the book on. I don't have the cover here. And I'm like, how is she going to involve us with an 11-year-old boy? How are we going to possibly, feel empathy and understand this child? But it's one of the books I remember the most. And it's probably maybe my top book of the year. It's about this boy, and his name is Stewie. And his parents died when he was a baby. He was raised by his sister, who's a nurse, and his grandmother lived with them. And she wasn't a great grandmother, but she was kind of all that he had. And he had an older brother who has a disability. But his grandmother raised chickens, and she would sell the eggs for extra money for the house because they needed it. And when she died, he took over caring for the chickens, and he sold the eggs. He put the cartons of eggs on his wagon, and he'd walk around the neighborhood selling the eggs. And he really loved these chickens. And one of the scenes that's really touching is when this older chicken, Mabel, who has stopped laying eggs, doesn't look right. And if you have an animal and you love it, when they're not right. And if you're anything like me, you've made extra trips to the vet because you worry that something's wrong, even if it's not. But at the vet, one of the people in the waiting room very cruelly says to him, well, if the chicken's not laying, you should just eat it. And he just, that's horrifying. And the vet's trying to be kind and says, she's old. She hasn't been laying long. She's probably at the end of her life. We don't know how much longer she's going to be around. And that breaks his heart. He's lost his grandmother, and he immediately can't stand the thought of her dying alone in the chicken coop. So he makes a place for her in his bedroom, and he puts her in a box, and he wraps her in a blanket, and he won't go to school because he can't stand the thought that she would be alone when she dies. And it's so touching. It's just so touching. In fact, I contacted Catherine Ryan Hyde to ask, do you raise chickens? She has horses. She has dogs that she's rescued. She has cats. She just adopted a kitten. Her pictures on social media are adorable. But I said, do you raise chickens? And she said, no, but a friend of hers does. And apparently she's vegan. She said the eggs from these chickens, who are very well cared for, are the only non-vegan food I'll eat. So she really cares strongly about animals. So when this boy is out selling the eggs, he makes the acquaintance of this older woman who probably is the same age as his grandmother. And she's not a very likable character. And she just seems really off. But it's about how this child and this older woman, who's kind of running away from something, we're not sure what it is, how they end up building this relationship. And the story is wonderful. There's no big twists, there's no big turns, but it's just that the way that Hyde writes is so moving and so touching. And if you love animals, you understand what she's saying and what she's sharing. So it's about the connections that we make with the animals that we love. And it's about our family, but it's also about the family that we choose, not just what family we're born into, but those we choose to make part of our family. And it's also about how we deal with loss, because he does have to deal with the loss of his grandmother and the loss of the chicken, Mabel. And that eventually all the chickens are going to die, just as those of us who have dogs and cats know that we will probably outlive them. it's something that we deal with, and we love them anyway and do it. But I can't wait to read the new book.
Well,
I'm
there you go. So you
excited.
have a treat ahead. You have a treat ahead.
So that's I love it. And I highly recommend it. It's just amazing.
Next, let's talk about Louise Penny's latest, A World of Curiosities, which I know you just loved. And it is the #1 indie bestseller this week. And she has been doing these large events, like one event after the other, and one more large venue than the next. So tell us about it.
I started reading her books in the middle of the series, and I never went back to the beginning because I have piles of books that I can't get to. But this book actually made me want to go back and start reading from the first book. In this book, what she does is, and forgive me if I don't pronounce the names right, but we see how Inspector Armand Gamache and Jean-G Beauvoir first meet. He ends up becoming Gamache's son-in-law, but in here, she takes us back to the first case where they meet, and the son-in-law is really a jerk in the beginning. You just hate him. You're like, this is the guy that becomes his son-in-law, really? And you just see Armand Gamache as this incredible person with patience and brilliance, and the way he brings everything wonderful out of people that on the surface seem like there's nothing below the surface. And of the books of hers I've read, this is probably my favorite. It's first of all, there's just so much packed into this book. There's the murder mystery, which is important, but there's so many other things that are important too. The town they live in, this little village of Three Pines that you read about, and then you really, really want to go to Montreal and find this village that isn't on any map. It's almost magical, and the people who live there are just these quirky characters. And so in this book, we learn, like kind of mystically from the poet Ruth, about how the village was founded. And she tells them it was founded because a witch in, I believe, 1600s in Montreal, this woman was accused of being a witch. She was a healer. And if you were a healer, then men feared you. And it's about how some men just fear women. So she takes us to the founding. I'm doing this totally out of order of my notes, but they were called witches. So someone says, did they have to have proof that they were witches? And she says, all a woman had to be was alive. Just being a woman was, in the church's eye, evil. And then they said, well, didn't there have to be a reason for killing these people who were called witches? And she says, and she goes on to say, why are gay and lesbian and transgender people attacked? Is there a reason Black men are shot? You don't need reasons to do these things if you have hate in your heart. A lot of this is about misogyny. And I learned about the Montreal Massacre, which I hadn't really heard of before, but it was when this gunman went into the School of Engineering in Montreal, and he went into one of the classrooms and he separated the men and the women, and he told the men to leave, and then he killed all the women because they shouldn't be studying engineering. They were feminists. And then he went out into the school shooting other women. And after this event, it kind of makes me angry because Canada did something about it and we don't. After this event, women pushed for stronger gun legislation, and they got it. A lot of the men in government thought they were overreacting, that it wasn't because of misogyny, that it wasn't because of this or that, but they did manage to pass common sense gun laws. And she writes about these women. Before the shooting, they were students. Now they were warriors. And personally, where I taught for 20 years was Highland Park, Illinois. And we all know what happened there on July 4th. And so reading this was very powerful too, because of what they were able to do that we are not able to do. The actual murder mystery is about this first case that we meet them on, that were Gamache meets Beauvoir. And a woman was murdered, and her two children are left alone because they don't know who their father is and their mother was just killed. I don't want to give anything away, but years later now, the children who are now adults have returned to the village and some strange things are happening. And Gamache and Beauvoir have different views of these two now adults. And we don't know if they're the guilty ones or if there's someone else. And someone I saw in the chat, someone posted that they're ranking a series of the Inspector Gamache novels. And I can't wait to see it because I'm sure it's going to be fantastic. But this book was just so powerful. And more than some of the other books, there's just so much to take in that she writes about. Just a lot there. If you're going to read one of the books, make it this one.
This is the one that you would get. This is the one you do pick up. You know,
if you only had time to read one of her books,
this
because she kind of starts at the beginning when they first meet anyway. And she does a great job sharing the characters and bringing people up to speed on who they are. So and there's dogs in them.
I think it's a brilliantly timed book too. She usually comes out in August. This one's out in November. Three Pines, the series, has just started on Amazon last weekend. So if you want to get an introduction to the characters, this is the time to come in. And it's funny because my husband was away last weekend and I thought this is one of these series I might be able to get him to watch. He usually only likes to watch a show. A series is like more than he wants to commit to. But I have a funny feeling this one he might enjoy. So I said, all right, I'll leave this one on the back burner. And then finally, you have Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmus, which is one of my favorite books of the year, is one of my bets-ons. And you might remember her as the Good Morning America Book Club pick. And I loved interviewing her earlier this year. She was tons of fun.
Well, this book apparently was on the bestseller list for 6 months. And it was, as you pointed out, the Barnes & Noble Book of the Year.
Yep.
And it's one of Amazon top 20 books as well. And they're doing an Apple TV series on it. And it's just... there's a reason that we love this book so much. It's just brilliant. And there is a dog in it too, which of course always helps, I think. And the dog is brilliant, but the writing is brilliant. Actually, the writing in all of these is brilliant, but I actually have to read a quote from this one to show its brilliance. It's about a character named Elizabeth Mott, who in the 50s and early 60s went for graduate work in chemistry. But as she was going for her PhD, her advisor tried to sexually assault her. And she, if you see on the cover, there's the pencil in her hair. She takes the pencil and she uses it as a weapon, which I think is brilliant. And she doesn't end up getting her PhD. So she does want to work as a chemist, and she's able to until for political reasons she can't. She has a daughter she has to raise and the dog she has to provide dog food for. So she ends up being on this cooking show. And she really wants it to be a chemistry show. So she makes it a cooking show where she also teaches chemistry. And the people, the men who run that show are like, no, it's just about cooking. Don't teach chemistry. Women aren't going to like that. Women aren't smart enough to understand that. Well, another book about misogyny. And she's like, no, women are smart enough to understand it. And there's actually one scene where a woman asks her in the audience, a woman asks her a medical question. And she says to the woman, oh, what kind of medical doctor are you? And the woman says, oh, I'm not a doctor. I'm just a housewife. And she says, there's no such thing as just a housewife. What kind of things do you like doing? And it turns out she likes to cook and she likes to sew. So Elizabeth Zott says, oh, clothing? And the woman says, no, bodies. My sons get into a lot of trouble. And Zott says, well, you wanted to be a doctor at one point, didn't you? What kind? She says, I wanted to be an open heart surgeon. And through the dialogue, you see Elizabeth Zott encouraging her to go and do that, to follow her dream. And it's super, super touching. But these lessons in chemistry and lessons in like civic perspective are just brilliant. So here's the quote that I have to read. It's during the cooking show. She's making a chicken pot pie and she's comparing it to society. She says, a successful chicken pot pie is like a society that functions at a highly efficient level. Call it Sweden. Here, every vegetable has its place. No single bit of produce demands to be more important than another. And when you throw in the additional spices, garlic, thyme, pepper, and sodium chloride, you've created a flavor that not only enhances each substance's texture, but balances the acidity. Result, subsidized childcare. Although I'm sure Sweden has its problems too. Skin cancer at the very least. But that's just like one of the things she does, chicken pot pie, Sweden, everybody works together. Isn't that wonderful?
And what's the dog's name? What's the dog's name? Remind me what the dog's
Dog's name is 630. And I read it so many months ago, I can't remember why. It's something about the time. Either it's the time she found him, because he's a rescue dog. And the dog is brilliant. He's learned almost 1,000 words, which no one believes. And the dog becomes a hero in the book, of course, which I absolutely love. It's also about, it seems like it would be a really light read and a light book, and it's not. It's a really powerful look at misogyny and life in the 50s and 60s and being true to yourself. And it's about loss, and it's about moving on. It's about treating everyone with respect, because so many people at that time treated women as less than. And she looked at these women and encouraged every single one of them to just do what you want to do and don't let the jerks get in your way. There was actually another quote I wanted to do about this one man that was just so stupid, who looked down on the women. And the last part of it was, he was so stupid, he didn't know how stupid he was. But it's just an amazing novel. I can't wait to see what the series becomes.
It's delightful. It's just
Another
delightful.
great.
First book written in her 50s, everybody. Just shows you, you just never know when. Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing those. It was great.
Thank you, Pam.
Thank you.
Next, we've got Stuart Shiffman, who's a lifelong avid reader. Upon his retirement after 22 years as a state court judge in Illinois, he was looking for an opportunity to turn passion into a project. He's an active participant in the law and literature movement, where works of literature are examined in an effort to better understand legal issues. So, Stuart, let's start with Making History, The Storytellers Who Shaped the Past by Richard Cohen. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure. Making History is one of those books that I like to describe as a book about books. And it always reminds me of the story, not a story, but the experience I had in a wonderful bookstore in Nashville, Tennessee, when I was roaming through the shelves, and one of the salespeople said, when you come to a bookstore, there are two kinds of books you look for. And I said, really? He said, yeah. There's the books you came in to buy because you knew you wanted to read them. And then there's the books you find on the shelf that you didn't know you wanted to read. And in the bookstore, when you find them, you can take them home. And that's kind of the experience I had in reading Making History, because there are a great many authors, and actually some of the people who Cohen discusses in the book are not actual historians that we would think about. They are historians in other medias. For example, Ken Burns, other people who have produced history in other fashions other than just on the pages of books. And he also has big sections on fictional historians. For the first one that you might think about is William Shakespeare, who wrote quite a few histories or treated history in many of his novels. And Dickens, Hilary Mantel. Cohen starts back with the medieval historians and comes all the way up to the present day. Actually, this book, it's kind of interesting. It was first published in England. And then when they sent it to the United States, the publishers here in the United States decided that they weren't going to publish it because they thought it was too light on African-American historians. And now I can't remember the other group, but Cohen took the book back, added to it. It's a very hefty book. We were talking about earlier about some of the books that we have and that approach 800 pages. This book is 780 pages. Okay. But the wonderful thing about it is, because of the nature of this book, If you don't want to read about Islamic historians, you can skip that chapter. The chapters, of course, on people like Churchill and the military historian John Keegan are very informative. And the chapters on others and books on others that I was not necessarily aware of are just wonderful chapters to read. I think the point that he makes, that he ends this book with, is the fact that all historians, regardless of how they present history, have bias. And as he says, one of the differences between non-fictional history and fictional history is that the non-fictional authors tell you what happened to the characters, but the fictional historians tell you how the characters felt. This is just, if you like history, I think this is the kind of book that you really want to take a look at. As I say, it's a long, there's a lot of material here, but I think that it's a very enjoyable book, and it will lead you to other books and to other authors that you may find very interesting, into other subject matters as well.
Very, very interesting.
That's great. Now, Stuart, your next two selections are biographies of major sports figures. So talk to us first about Path Lit by Lightning by David Maraniss.
Well, I'm going to talk about both of them kind of together, if it's okay, because
that works. Yeah,
they are so related in ways that you don't even think about. Here's the first one. This is, Path Lit by Lightning by David Maraniss, and this is the story of Jim Thorpe. The other book is, I'm breaking up there, too close. The Last Folk Hero, which is the story of Bo Jackson, the biography of Bo Jackson. And while I never thought about this as I picked these books to read, and as I was reading them over the summer and fall, it's a very interesting process if you think about it. Jim Thorpe is viewed by most people as the greatest athlete of the first half of the 20th century. Bo Jackson is viewed by many people as the greatest athlete of the second half of the 20th century. And there are a lot of similarities in their life that I'm going to try to at least talk about very briefly. But even before that, David Maraniss wrote the book on Jim Thorpe. And David Maraniss is one of America's, I think, personally, one of America's finest biographers. He's a former Washington Post editor and writer, and he's written books on subjects that range all the way from presidents of the United States to great athletes. And I think in some ways, he wrote a book many years ago about Vince Lombardi, the coach of the Green Bay Packers, and it was one of those sports biographies that really changed the way people look at their subjects. Growing up, I remember reading a lot of sports stories, and they were always about they told you what great lives the sports figures had. They didn't tell you anything bad about their lives. And we know now from many sports figures that there's a lot of bad things in their lives, in fact. And Maraniss covered those, and he covers them in this book as well. Bo Jackson book is written by Jeff Pearlman, who's another well-known biographer, but who's confined himself to sports. He's written books on Jackson. He wrote a biography of one of my, being from Illinois, Walter Payton. He wrote a book called Sweetness, which was about Payton's life. And at the time that book came out, a lot of people in Chicago were very upset because he covered some of the less heroic aspects of his life. Mm-hmm. He's also written a book about the Los Angeles Lakers that I believe was made into I think it's an HBO series that ran this summer. So these are two men who really work on their sports figures. Of course, Bo Jackson would not talk to Pearlman when he wrote this book, but Pearlman did exhaustive research, and the characters themselves are very similar. Jim Thorpe was born on an Indian reservation in Oklahoma, came from a broken family. Bo Jackson was born in Alabama to a broken family. When Bo Jackson was a young man, he was afflicted with a very serious stutter, and people would make fun of him, and his response always was that he would just beat them up until he got into his life of sports. Thorpe was taken to the Carlisle University in Pennsylvania, which was an Indian school, and as Marinus describes it, the basic process at the Carlisle school was that what they did was they took the Indian out of American Indians. Thorpe gained his athletic prowess, and he went to the 1912 Olympics in Stockholm. He won the pentathlon, which is a five-event sport, and then the decathlon. And the King of Sweden called him the greatest athlete in the world. The thing I learned from reading this book that I had not realized was that two things. When Thorpe went to Sweden and represented the United States in the Olympics, he was not even a citizen. American Indians did not become citizens when they were born in the United States. They had to earn their citizenship, basically. He didn't become a citizen until he was close to 30. But he came back from the Olympics, and that same year, the Olympics were in the summer, he came back, and in the fall of that year, he led Carlisle to a mythical national football championship. They beat, for their last game of the year, they beat West Point at the academy, and in that game, Thorpe played against Dwight Eisenhower and Omar Bradley. And their goal in the game was to injure Thorpe so he wouldn't be able to play and he wouldn't be able to keep playing. But they failed in that. They didn't have the Heisman Trophy back in 1912, but had they had one, he probably would have won it. He was the greatest player in football, college football. He went on to help start the National Football League, and he had a very good career in baseball. So, and then he ended his life, sadly. He had personal tragedies, but he came to Hollywood, and he was an actor in many Hollywood movies. And one of the things he worked very hard for in Hollywood was to increase and improve the role of American Indians in the movie industry. Bo Jackson was one that we all recall, I think, from because he was obviously a much more modern athlete. And my favorite story about Bo Jackson, well, there's two stories about Bo Jackson. One is this: at the time he was at Auburn University playing football, there were two other fellows at that university, two other athletes. One was Charles Barkley, and one was Frank Thomas, who both, of course, Frank Thomas went to the Hall of Fame in baseball, and Barkley was one of the 50 greatest players in the National Basketball Association. But Jackson actually surpassed both of them. When Jackson was in high school, where he first started to play sports, his high school was so poor, they didn't have a track. So Jackson would work on the hurdles by running over folding chairs in the hallways of his school. He became in Alabama, they had the decathlon, and Jackson participated in the decathlon in high school, and he set records in that event that are still held. He still holds today. His high school couldn't afford pole vaulting and didn't have a pole vaulting pit. So Jackson would go to the event, he would borrow a pole from another athlete, and he would pole vault just enough so that he'd score a few points in that event. But generally, by the time the event came to the decathlon came to the end, and the last event was the 1,500 meters, Bo didn't like to run that long, that far. But he was so far ahead that he could just not even bother to run, and he would still win the high school decathlon in the state of Alabama. Of course, we know that later on in his life, he played baseball. He played baseball for my White Sox, as a matter of fact. And He had a very serious hip injury in football that ended his football career. He still lives up in Chicago, by the way, and he does a lot of charitable work and gives a lot of time to charity, although he has a reputation of being kind of mean and brusque. But he does a lot of charitable work. These are two wonderful biographies. I love sports biographies, especially because they place the people, the sports figures, in the context of what's going on. Jackson grew up during the end of the civil rights era, when even still, when he was in college in Auburn, Black athletes did not mix with the white athletes very much. And of course, Jim Thorpe, through his entire life, had to overcome the fact that he was deemed a second-class citizen by most of the people in this country. So, I love them both, and I highly recommend.
Excellent.
You
Excellent
cover these sports biographies so well for us. So thank you so much for talking about these with us. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Next up, we have Megan Elliott, who is originally from the Chicago area and currently lives in Southern California, where she works for an entertainment news website and spends her days watching and writing about TV, though she prefers reading, of course. Hi, Megan. Great to have you here.
Hi, Tom. How are you? It's great to be
Good.
here. This has been so much. I have such a list, like everybody else, of everything to read now.
So great to hear. So now, Megan, let's talk about your first pick, which is Mecca by Susan Straight.
Sure. So Susan Straight she's a really prolific author. She's a native Californian. She grew up in a part of the state called the Inland Empire, which is sort of just east of Los Angeles. It's sort of getting into the desert area. She still lives there. She works as a professor at the University of California, Riverside. And this book is a series of, it's a novel, interconnected stories about people who live in this region that's kind of the less glamorous part of California. They're not the Hollywood, not the beach, the inland areas. It's hot, it's dry, there's Amazon warehouses everywhere. It's definitely not the flashy part of the state. Her characters, they come from like a wide range of backgrounds. It's a book that's really concerned with identity. So some of the characters are descendants of the original Mexican and Spanish settlers from before California was part of the United States. Some are recent undocumented immigrants. Some are descendants of enslaved people. And they all kind of come together in this mix. And they're just sort of dealing with all of these really complicated situations. One of the central characters is a California Highway Patrol officer. Another is an undocumented woman who's working as a maid. It mostly takes place during the coronavirus pandemic. So that's like this constant backdrop of how these people are dealing with this. One of them is a nurse, but they're dealing with police brutality. They're dealing with climate change and wildfires, ice raids, and then sort of everyday challenges, parenting, divorce, relationships, all that stuff. And I really love this book. It dives into these really interesting and complex questions about identity and how we see ourselves versus how other people see us, and how, people on the outside often want to put these characters that she's created into boxes to understand them, and they don't fit in these boxes, and they really resist that in really interesting ways. And it's also just like a love letter to this place that she's from. Like she's such a staunch advocate of this area, and she really brings it to life. And I had moved to the Inland Empire, this area where she writes about, just before the pandemic. And I lived in California for about a decade before that, but this was a part of the state I didn't really know. And I came into it with some really preconceived notions about what it was like. And I think this book, helps me understand the place that I live in a really interesting way. And there's all these really emotional moments. I don't even want to get into it because it's going to spoil the story. But I just really think if you want to understand anything about California or just kind of the current climate in the US right now, it's such a good book, and it's really, really worth reading. I highly recommend it.
It sounds great, especially because it's called Mecca. It's like really where you do want to get.
Yes, and Mecca is
get there.
Yeah, that plays into it, and it is actually the name of a real place in California that some of these characters end up living. So it's really interesting.
So Susan Straight's the author. Somebody's asking in the chat who the author is. So it's Susan Straight. So your next book is Devil House by John Darnielle. Darnielle, yes. What can you tell us about that?
So yeah, this is John Darnielle's third novel. He also wrote a book called Wolf and White Van a few years ago and another one called Universal Harvester. And he's also, a lot of people, if anyone here is to music, indie rock, he is the main songwriter for a band called the Mountain Goats that has a very enthusiastic fan base. That's actually how I came to discover his books. So this book, we talked a little bit earlier, someone was talking about true crime, and this is a book that really like kind of interrogates the idea of true crime and true crime writing and like what goes into kind of like making that sausage and everything. So it's about a writer named Gage Chandler, and he's made him name for himself. He wrote a nonfiction book about a murder that happened in his hometown in San Luis Obispo in the 1970s. And that's kind of how he made his name. And he's written some more books since then of kind of diminishing quality and success, I guess you would say. And he's trying to find like another real successful book. And he hits on this idea of exploring this murder that happened in the Bay Area in the mid 80s. That's kind of this sort of supposedly satanic crime, kind of like happened at the height of the satanic panic. And so what he does is he moves up to this suburb of San Francisco. He buys the house where these murders took place and he moves in and he goes about sort of like recreating what happened. And it sort of follows along as he does this. And he's trying to sort of separate the rumor and the myth and the urban legend, you know, from the facts. And so he can put together this book. But it really doesn't go the way where you might think it's going. It kind of takes like a left turn. I don't want to get into it because like I'll spoil it, but it goes in places you might not expect. And it gets into the stories of some of the other people connected with the crimes. The woman who had committed the murders that he wrote about initially in his first book. We hear about her. We hear about the mother of one of the victims of that crime. It really does, I think, an excellent job of pulling back the layers of kind of like what goes into telling these true crime stories and what we're hoping to get out of them and like who gets hurt when you tell those stories. So yeah, I think if you consume true crime in any way, whether it's podcasts or Netflix documentaries or whatever, I highly recommend it. If you like the Mountain Goats, definitely read it. He just has these really interesting characters. He does a really good job of writing about these sort of disaffected loners and teenagers, like who like are like the Dungeons and Dragons kind of like heavy metal kids, like, and he really treats them with a lot of sympathy, while also kind of like acknowledging all of their flaws and everything. So, and it also, this one I actually do have the cover for. I don't know if you can see it.
Yes,
but this one I have the hardback, and this has nothing to do with the quality of the book, but it has a great cover, and it even has like the raised lettering from like sort of like a 80s or 90s like pulp paperback sort of true crime book. So I thought that was a nice touch.
Oh.
Nice touch, literally.
Yes.
Literally. And your last selection is True Story, What Reality TV Says About Us by Danielle J. Leidman, yes?
Lindemann, I think.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so like as I think Tom mentioned in my bio, I write about TV for my day job. So this was a book, and part of my writing about TV involves writing about reality TV, because that is a lot of what is on TV right now, as I'm sure people here probably are aware. And I have kind of complicated feelings about that. I'm not like the most avid consumer of reality television. And this was a book I kind of picked up just mostly for professional reasons initially. I was like, kind of just wanted to like sort of think about it more critically and kind of dig into it. And I ended up really enjoying it. I also wanted to highlight a nonfiction book this year. I mostly read and write about and review fiction, and this was kind of like me pushing my boundaries. But Lindemann is a professor of sociology, and she is unabashedly like a huge reality TV fan. Like she loves the genre. She, everything from, The Real World to The Bachelor, she loves it. But True Story is really like a serious scholarly look at reality TV and what the stories we're seeing play out in those shows tells us about us. She talks about Survivor, she talks about Real Housewives, she talks about The Apprentice, she gets to it at the end. She kind of saves that for the last part. Each chapter looks at a different topic, race, class, gender, family, deviance through the lens of reality TV. And she unpacks how those shows kind of reinforce social norms. Sometimes they push boundaries, sometimes they expose these fault lines in our culture. I think the takeaway is just that, reality TV is kind of this like funhouse mirror of society. And it reflects our culture back to us, not always in the most flattering way, but it's worth studying. And reading it is really like it's kind of like taking a crash course, like a really fun crash course in sociology from a really cool professor. I mean, that's basically what it is. So if you want to learn more about sociology or refresh if you haven't thought about it since you were an undergrad, this book is a great starting point. And I just really appreciate the way it takes this form of pop culture that is so easily dismissed and so easily written off and examines it in a critical way. So whether you're secretly binging The Bachelorette or whatever when you're not reading, or if you turn up your nose at those things, I think either way, you'll probably find it illuminating.
My husband was in a restaurant one night with my son when they were recording a reality show. And he said, there's nothing real about this. They did it 15 times. And he said, we couldn't leave because we were in the shot. And he's like, again, can you get the line right? It's really funny.
Yeah. That's a whole other question, like how real is the reality TV? But
yeah, there you go. But I would love to write about TV because I find TV absolutely, besides reading books these days, what's out there is absolutely crazy, on many levels.
Yes. And I did see that some people were talking about the Three Pines series on Prime Video, and that is worth watching. I've seen the first few episodes. I have not watched all of it, but yeah, professional recommendation. Watch that one. There you go.
Thanks for joining us, Megan. Glad to have you here for the first time.
So much.
Thank you, Megan.
And last but by no means least, joining us this evening is Ray Palen, who is an award-winning actor, drama teacher, former executive producer, director for 15 plus years of a highly successful regional theater group that is still based on Long Island. He's also a published playwright with several short plays being registered with the Writers Guild of America. He currently works as a drama teacher at the Polk County Public Schools in Florida, and are they lucky to have him? So, Ray, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And I know it's been a long evening. Thank you so much, everyone, for staying with us so far.
Of course. It feels like a bit of book shaming because I've also been keeping a list of all the titles I have. I read over 200 books a year, and the number of books I've written down tonight is enormous.
Yeah, it's like, oh wait, I've got to go read this. I think people have done a good job of hand selling these books tonight.
Yes,
really hand selling.
It's amazing.
You're going to start us with The Sea of Tranquility by Emily St. John Mandel. So tell us about this and why you picked it.
Yes, well, I'll hold it up here for those who can see it. I think my background. Oh, there we go. As an actor, I fell in love with her Station 11 some years back because of it was a traveling troupe of actors in a kind of post-apocalyptic, post-pandemic world, and it was just made into a terrific series on HBO Max this past year. And she had me sold with that. I enjoyed her last novel, also Glass Hotel, but then this one came out, and I love seeing how different authors, especially fiction authors, are dealing with the pandemic and how the world has changed over the last couple of years. Some seem to just avoid it completely in their recurring series, and others are tackling it straight on. This is her novel that she is not only clearly writing it as a response to the pandemic, but it also is a very partially bleak, but mostly uplifting view of our future, because it ends with a future that has another great pandemic coming down the road, and it kind of ties all that together. What I found very interesting about the novel is I've seen it make a lot of best of lists for the year. I saw in one contest they had it sorted as science fiction, which kind of took me aback for a moment, because while it has science fiction elements, I felt this was pure literary fiction. I mean, she's quite a writer, and there are so many different things going on in this, and it's not as much time travel as it is almost like all the different events that she covers in the novel, from the 1900s in a wilderness scene in Canada through a futuristic colony of the moon, where there's a detective who is going back in time and looking at all these different moments in time from that first one in the 1900s through his present day. And it's almost like he pulls a thread and ties them all together with one moment, and literally a moment that's also tied together by music. There's a scene where there's a violinist playing in an airport lounge, and in the 1900s, someone in the backwoods in Canada hears that same violin music playing that was playing in our present time in this airport, and that's also transcends into these scenes on the colony of the moon. And just without giving anything away, because this is the one book that I've most recommended to people this year to read. The way that she ties it together at the end is brilliant. It's heartwarming. I think I mentioned when I reviewed it that it's a book that demanded to be written, and I think it answers so many questions during a very confusing time for us with mankind now. And I indicated also that for me, it felt like it was bringing back great literature as being the panacea for the masses that we so need. You know, when people have sometimes bad times and they may not have a friend to turn to, that book can serve as that friend. And yes, yeah, you see my new kitten playing games. Yes, this is Shuri, my little black panther, and she's purring. She chose now in 2 hours to jump on my lap, which is nice. Because Daddy's talking.
But she knew. Wait, she knew the camera was on. Come on.
She knew the camera was on. That was it. The other 3 cats are older. They're sleeping. She's still up and having fun. So Emily St. John Mandel's novel, it definitely will be my #1 novel of the year. It just it moved me, and I love novels that make you think, make you feel, and leave you with images that you want to go back and reread it because of what it does for you. And I like Station 11 more because of the acting bit, but for this year, I think for this time, this is the best pandemic since the pandemic started in 2020. This is the best novel I've read that gave some answers and like I said, that feeling of what a novel can do for you in tough times blew me away.
Well, your next book on the list, I said, no way this was published this year.
No
way. I said to Tom, no way. So
no.
You introduced this one.
Yeah, so it's J.R. Tolkien's The Fall of the Numenor, which is edited by Brian Sibley.
Yes.
So give us a scoop on this one.
I will hold this up. I grew up reading classic literature, which is why I throw myself so much now into thrillers and horror and things like that. I almost felt like I paid my dues already, but I still miss great literature, and Tolkien was there for me. At a very young age, I fell in love with it long before, the films came out and the new popularity, and now with the Amazon series and everything. I remember being at a class reunion for my grade school and having some of my old colleagues telling my wife he was into The Hobbit long before anyone had ever heard of it before. So Tolkien's he's got quite a history now. J.R. Tolkien passed away in 1973. If it wasn't for his son, Christopher, who died at age 95 just 2 years ago, we probably wouldn't have even had those movies made, because he tirelessly went and made sure that not only was his father's work still relevant and still out there in some form, but he went and wrote himself a 12-volume history of Middle-earth, which just kind of took stories and tales and things that his father had just introduced in his novels and just fully, it was almost like reading a fictional history book. And it was just incredible. The Fall of Numenor does that as well. And I hand it to Brian Sibley for now picking up where Christopher left off and taking the tales of not only some of the stories from Silmarillion, which was the last novel that J.R. Tolkien had ever put out, but it also goes into the whole origin of Sauron and then the rings. And when it gets to the part where, Sauron's finger with the ring on it is cut off in battle, and then the ring is first taken before it's lost, and then ages later found by Gollum and what we know in the films, it just it took me right back. I found the last couple of Tolkien novels like this that I've read have been good, but had been a tad dry. It seemed like it was more about the second part of the book which were all the recommendations and where everything was drawn from. And this, even with myself knowing the story and being such a big fan, it taught me new things. It had me spellbound with suspense, even though I knew how things were going to end. Just to be able, again, to give us that kind of what the series now on Amazon Prime is showing us, the origins of Sauron and how that evil and Mordor and everything was created, and even long before the ring was even talked about. This goes very deep into not only the forming of the ring, but it also talks about how the ring wraiths, who are those evil dark riders that we see in the films for Lord of the Rings, were actually men from Numenor, who when Numenor fell, they had already turned and sided with Sauron before then. So it's like their penance is to serve him and Mordor, even though Numenor no longer exists. And I loved it because it went through the whole destruction. It was almost like Numenor is Tolkien's Atlantis, and it shows how this once great island city, which many Tolkien fans may not be aware of, and now thankfully we're introduced to in the Rings of Power series that's out now, but they haven't seen it be destroyed yet. So reading The Fall of Numenor was it took me right back, and it added something. And I'm so glad that someone like Brian Sibley is out there and collecting these things now with the absence of Christopher Tolkien. It gives me hope that, we're going to continue to see some of his past work and Christopher's father's work continue to be relevant.
Interesting, because I was doubting with Tom. I said, no, wait, hold on a second.
Yeah.
Wait, what are we talking about here? So
yeah,
glad we figured that out.
So much new material in there, and the artwork in it is also breathtaking.
Well, now finally tell us your thoughts about Sophie Hannah's latest, The Couple at the Table. I love Sophie. I met her a couple of years ago.
Oh, I adore Sophie Hannah. My two favorite mystery writers of all time are Agatha Christie and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. If I had nothing to read the rest of my life but novels by them and home stories, I would be fine. And Sophie Hannah, as we know, was, and I'll hold up The Couple at the Table, Sophie Hannah was picked by the Christie Society to continue the Hercule Poirot mystery series, which is quite an honor because they don't let a lot of people do things under Agatha's name. And it's only because Sophie Hannah is so brilliant. This novel, you can easily tell that they made the right selection with that, because it so reminded me of a Christie work. It has the locked room mystery in it. It has the myriad of characters. And what I found the most surprising and for me engaging about it is it wasn't marketed at all as being a D.I. Waterhouse Zalia novel. Like, she has a recurring series with those two detectives in it, and they're in this novel as well. And it's almost like when they popped up, initially for me it was a distraction. I'm like, oh no, it's going to be one of their novels now. But they happen to be guests at this travel resort where the murder takes place. And what happens is the story starts right out. And, without, can't say it's giving anything away, because the very first line is a letter that's being written to other guests who are at this travel resort saying, this is to the murderer of Jane. So Jane is murdered, and she's the victim, but it's this woman, Lucy, who's writing this now. And Lucy's ex-husband has married Jane. Jane was their midwife while Lucy was pregnant. So it was not a good separation. And where most people would have a very difficult time having any relationship with them, she's remarried. She's very happy with her new marriage and decides to be the bigger person and make friends with her ex-husband and the woman who stole him from her. And the thing that kind of puts a damper on that relationship is Lucy and her new husband show up at this resort while Jane and her husband William are there celebrating their honeymoon. So they feel that Lucy and her husband have gone there just to rub it in their face and as an act of revenge. And it really was purely by accident. They just happened to pick the same dates. The other thing that makes it uncomfortable is that the resort is owned by Jane's father. And the only reason why Lucy selected it is because Jane had been going on and on about this wonderful resort that's not far away that they can drive to. So they go and they limit the amount of couples that are there. There's only 8 bungalows. One of the bungalows happens to be taken by Zalia and Waterhouse, who are there on a vacation, who are a married couple as well as being DIs. So what happens is during the time while they're all together, Jane starts getting these threatening letters. Well, beware. One of the letters says, beware of the couple at the table nearest to you, which makes absolutely no sense to her because the way they set things up in the dining room, they're sitting in the middle at a seat of honor because they're the honeymoon couple, and every other diner who switches nightly, the tables are all equidistant to their table. So she has no idea who it is to beware of or who's sending her. She immediately believes it must be Lucy. But we know from the very, very start, with Lucy sending these letters out trying to solve the crime herself, that it's not her. As much as she feels resentment for her ex-husband, and as much as they have many tete-a-tetes during this vacation, she might want to kill Jane, but she does not. Someone else does. But the problem is that Jane and the husband dash away after an argument at dinner in front of everyone, but they're the only couple to leave the dining room. All the other couples are still there and all vouching for each other as an alibi. Waterhouse and Zalia go, we better go check on them because they might be at each other's throats. And when they get to the bungalow, Jane's been brutally stabbed to death. The husband is sitting in kind of a catatonic state in a chair with his back to her, with the murder weapon on the floor right behind him. But yet the blood pathologist says that the blood spatter shows it couldn't have been the husband. He would have had more blood on him in different areas. So now you've got kind of that locked room sort of mystery where the catatonic husband supposedly couldn't have done it. All the other guests vouch for each other as being in the dining room together. And yet the woman who had gotten on everyone's nerves during the course of the vacation has been murdered. And Lucy takes it upon herself when she gets back home after she's been cleared of sending a letter to every other guest saying whoever the murderer is and basically urging them to come forward. And it's just brilliant.
It's like their own version of the White Lotus.
Oh, yes. Yeah. They mention that in there as well. They compare the place to White Lotus. But the whole denouement when Waterhouse comes at the end, and 6 months later gets everyone to come back to recreate the dining room scene. And then kind of like a Poirot moment, he then unveils, this is what I figured out. It took him 6 months after the crime to do it, but he got it. And it was those letters Lucy sent out that kind of jogged his mind and put him on the right path. And again, you can so see how Sophie Hannah was the right choice to be stepping into the shoes of Dame Agatha, because this could hold up next to any of Christie's mysteries.
Now you made me really want to read that. And I described that book in how many previews, Tom, right?
I know, right.
And I talked about it so many library events, and I'm like, wow, I really want to read that book now. It was fabulous, fabulous presentation.
Yeah,
Fabulous.
Thank you. Yeah, I just love it. I look forward to everything she does.
Yeah, she was a lot of fun to meet too. Gosh, that was probably 6 years ago at this point.
No.
Well, that is the end of our live author presentations. We've gone so long tonight. Tom, do you just want to share what the books are from the others, or do you want to do it in an email? What do you want to do?
Yeah, we're going to do it in an email, but we're also going to put together a blog where, unfortunately, Jess Ciliano and Ron Kaplan were not able to join us, but we're definitely going to get their picks into a blog, so you'll be able to see what they recommend.
Well, I think that was really terrific. I have to tell you, I mean, for all of our reviewer guests, one was better than the next. And I really love getting a chance to see them. We got to do this more than once a year, Tom. I think we really do. I think we've got to do it in like June with summer picks or
so
something.
Much fun. And for me, it's such a thrill to be able to see all of the reviewers face to face, after all of the emails that I send them, you're reading their great work. So it's really great to be able to do this. Love it.
So I say a big round of applause to all of our reviewers. We're lucky to have you, as well as all of our readers. Thank you so much for so many of you that joined us and stayed with us tonight. We're going to do a follow-up email to everybody with a link to this presentation as both a video and a podcast. We're going to be able to do that. Yes, it was much longer than we all anticipated, Jerry. I see that in the comments. In case you want to view it again or share it with your book-loving friends. So then you'll be able to do that. If you missed a section because you ran out to get a drink of water or something, this is what you've got. There also will be an email that will come out with how the titles attached. And we will also do, Tom will figure out how to do the covers all so that everybody can see all the covers. We want to try to drop them into the video. We've got a live event coming up because, let me just tell you, this is our last big event like this of 2022. I am hopefully going to pull together a video next week of my bets on selections, see if I can get that together. And we've got some stuff coming up in January. First up, we will be doing our Bookaccino live preview event on Wednesday, January 11th at 2:00 in the afternoon. Our Bookaccino live event is something that we invented in the first July of the pandemic, where I sat there and said, how can we tell people what they're not being able to see at the bookstore and the library? And this program has become so popular, we've continued to do this. So our next Bookaccino live preview will be happening on January 11th at 2:00 in the afternoon. You can sign up on the Book Reporter Reading Group Guides website right now. Our next evening event will be an event with Nita Prose, which will be happening. It's our Bookaccino live book group event, which is going to take place on Wednesday, January 25th at 8 p.m. Our guest is going to be Nita, and we are going to be talking about The Maid, which is a GMA book club pick and a Book Reporter bets on selection. So we've got that coming up for you. And then the next event, just a reminder to you all, we've got more than 150 Book Reporter author interviews on our YouTube channel, which is the Book Report Network, or wherever you listen to podcasts, you can find the Book Reporter Talks To podcast. And literally, we've got 150 plus interviews, really in-depth interviews. Usually they're somewhere between 45 minutes and an hour long, and we get way into the writing with the authors. I may do one more this year. If not, we're going to pick up next year. And if you never want to miss an event, be sure you sign up for our newsletters at tbrnetwork.com. We've got an on sale this week, a weekly Book Reporter newsletter, and we've also got a Reading Group Guides newsletter. So sign up there so you never miss anything, because people always saying, I missed this. And I'm like, just sign up for the newsletter. You won't miss anything, or check in on one of our pages. And from Tom and myself, I want to wish you all a very, very, very happy holiday and all good things for 2023. We're already getting excited about books for next year.
We're really looking forward to sharing all kinds of books with you next year. We're delving into the early part of the year already, and there's plenty to share. So we're looking forward to that.
We've been watching previews since October. We've got a big one on Thursday. We're going to be seeing a number of books from Random House. And Tom and I have been watching these for weeks. And now I'm sitting there like, how can we read all these books? I don't know how we're going to be able to do this, go back and go forward. So thank you very much to everyone for joining us this evening. I know it was a long night, but you know what? Next year, we're just going to bill it as a long night, Tom. We're just going to say this is the way to rock your way.
Why not?
I mean, look, you got the Rockin' New Year. You got Rockin' Book Reporter. You know what I mean? Rockin' the books.
Thank you so much for joining us, everybody.